Sorry. Good evening, everybody. I'm Jordan McGee, Director of Education here at the National Atomic Testing Museum. I know a lot of you already know that. For those of you who don't, as always, on behalf of our staff and board, I want to welcome you and thank you so much for coming out this evening for this lecture. According to the schedules you all have, this is the last lecture of the year, but I have good news, it's actually not. I'm going to announce now that we've added one more lecture for the year in December. It's going to be on Friday, December the 8th. Friday night, again, with the meet and greet and reception at 6, with the lecture starting at 6:30 p.m. It's going to be called the Radiation Risks for Space Travel. So it's going to be a science radiation themed lecture, which will coincide with our new radiation exhibit, which will be coming up and going up in this room in the next couple of weeks. So hopefully when you actually come back for the lecture, the exhibit will be up. The lecture is going to be given by scientist, author, and UNLV professor, Dr. Francis Cucinato. He actually is fairly new to UNLV within the last couple of years, and before that he spent several decades working for NASA as their chief radiation scientist as far as human dosimetry goes. So he knows very well the radiation risks for space travel, and will be able to share some really great information about that unique risk posed to astronauts as they go off to Mars and beyond. So Friday, December the 8th for that. If you want to RSVP for that lecture, I can actually take your name down after the lecture. Just come to the check-in table and I will write you down. As far as tonight's lecture goes, my predecessor, Joe, who some of you may remember, actually scheduled tonight's lecture more than a year ago, intending it to complement the upcoming release of the new Star Wars movie. And I think he was using the Force when he chose the date, because it seems like right about now we're all getting really extra antsy to see what's going to happen next in the Skywalker saga. So if you came tonight because you're really interested in Reagan's SDI program, our speaker has you covered. And if you came tonight because you're on pins and needles like me, waiting for the release of The Last Jedi, our speaker also has you covered. As I've been joking in all of our advertisements for the last couple of weeks, in either case, this is the lecture you're looking for. Our speaker tonight is a senior scientist for the contractor at the Nevada National Security Site and has a professional background in geology and geophysics, hydrology, space science, and of course health physics. He's a frequent host and science subject matter expert for a variety of television programs on Nat Geo Channel, the Travel Channel, the History Channel, and the Weather Channel. Did I get them all? So you may have seen him in your very own living rooms. Of course you may have, and some of you definitely have seen him here at the museum before, because he is a frequent lecturer here. He was our speaker back in June for Asteroid Day this year, and early plug, he will be speaking at Asteroid Day again next year, right here. So please give me a please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ben McGee.
Very much. Let me see, is this, you guys hear me? Is this okay? No? Yes?
Close to your mouth.
Not really? Well, let me do. I will use the pen mode. Stand by. Alright. I won't wave as frenetically if I'm holding a microphone in my hand. Okay, oh, hey, alright, this is better. Thank you very much. I want to thank Jordan and the museum for having me tonight. Like I said, this is, they mentioned this was scheduled, Jordan mentioned this was scheduled more than a year ago, and that's because I actually gave a much lighter version of this talk to a room of 3 people, one of which was my mother. Here during one of the May the Science Be With You days back in 2016, but we were parked way over in a conference room in the other building, and I don't think anyone knew we were there. So Joe felt, he said, well, this is a really cool talk, so why don't we just do it again, and you can ramp it up, and then we'll do it in 2017. It seems so far away at the time. So with that context, this talk really, this is a top level talk. So I want to explore with you guys the idea of Star Wars, the idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, and where they come together, and how did that all happen. And this talk kind of introduces itself, so if you bear with me for maybe 16 seconds. We can do better than that. I'll just let this go. If it decides to. Thinking about it.
Double click.
Sorry. Good evening, everybody. I'm Jordan McGee, Director of Education here at the National Atomic Testing Museum. I know a lot of you already know that. For those of you who don't, as always, on behalf of our staff and board, I want to welcome you and thank you so much for coming out this evening for this lecture. According to the schedules you all have, this is the last lecture of the year, but I have good news, it's actually not. I'm going to announce now that we've added one more lecture for the year in December. It's going to be on Friday, December the 8th. Friday night, again, with the meet and greet and reception at 6, with the lecture starting at 6:30 p.m. It's going to be called the Radiation Risks for Space Travel. So it's going to be a science radiation themed lecture, which will coincide with our new radiation exhibit, which will be coming up and going up in this room in the next couple of weeks. So hopefully when you actually come back for the lecture, the exhibit will be up. The lecture is going to be given by scientist, author, and UNLV professor, Dr. Francis Cucinato. He actually is fairly new to UNLV within the last couple of years, and before that he spent several decades working for NASA as their chief radiation scientist as far as human dosimetry goes. So he knows very well the radiation risks for space travel, and we'll be able to share some really great information about that unique risk posed to astronauts as they go off to Mars and beyond. So Friday, December the 8th for that. If you want to RSVP for that lecture, I can actually take your name down after the lecture. Just come to the check-in table and I will write you down. As far as tonight's lecture goes, my predecessor, Joe, who some of you may remember, actually scheduled tonight's lecture more than a year ago, intending it to complement the upcoming release of the new Star Wars movie. And I think he was using the Force when he chose the date, because it seems like right about now we're all getting really extra antsy to see what's going to happen next in the Skywalker saga. So if you came tonight because you're really interested in Reagan's SDI program, our speaker has you covered. And if you came tonight because you're on pins and needles like me, waiting for the release of The Last Jedi, our speaker also has you covered. As I've been joking in all of our advertisements for the last couple of weeks, in either case, this is the lecture you're looking for. Our speaker tonight is a senior scientist for the contractor at the Nevada National Security Site and has a professional background in geology and geophysics, hydrology, space science, and of course health physics. He's a frequent host and science subject matter expert for a variety of television programs on Nat Geo Channel, the Travel Channel, the History Channel, and the Weather Channel. Did I get them all? So you may have seen him in your very own living rooms. Of course you may have, and some of you definitely have seen him here at the museum before because he is a frequent lecturer here. He was our speaker back in June for Asteroid Day this year, and early plug, he will be speaking at Asteroid Day again next year, right here. So please give me please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ben McGee.
Thank you very much. Let me see, is this, you guys hear me? Is this okay? No? Yes?
Close to your mouth.
Not really? Well, I will use a handheld. Stand by. Alright. I won't wave as frenetically if I'm holding a microphone right here. Okay, oh, hey, all right, this is better. Thank you very much. I want to thank Jordan and the museum for having me tonight. Like I said, this is, they mentioned this was scheduled, Jordan mentioned this was scheduled more than a year ago, and that's because I actually gave a much lighter version of this talk to a room of 3 people, one of which was my mother, here during one of the May the Science Be With You days back in 2016, but we were parked way over in a conference room in the other building, and I don't think anyone knew we were there. So Joe he said, well, this is a really cool talk, so why don't we just do it again, and you can ramp it up, and then we'll do it in 2017. It seems so far away at the time. So with that context, this talk really, this is a top level talk. So I want to explore with you guys the idea of Star Wars, the idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, and where they come together, and how did that all happen. And this talk kind of introduces itself, so if you bear with me for maybe 16 seconds. We can do better than that. I'll just let this go. If it decides to. Thinking about it.
Double click.
Here for what we're about to get into, and so yes, not so long ago in a galaxy very close, in fact so close we're in it, this happened. So let's see if I can keep going here. Let's make this real hard. And is there a, oh wait, yeah, I will turn it on. That would help. Okay, technical difficulties aside. All right, and boom. Okay, so what are we talking about tonight? Reagan's SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. It's not weird if I'm used to wandering in front of the screen, so if I fall off, I'll get back up. There's a thing here. Right, so what's this talk going to look like? Basically, I'll briefly go over what it is. It's a few decades old now. Then what happened? Is Star Wars relevant? And what I mean by that is in both cases. Now, does it make more sense to spend money expanding our nuclear stockpile or rendering it ineffective? Where should we be spending the dollars? And so that's why he became basically father of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is let's find a way to make these things ineffective. And all of a sudden, we've gotten out of, it's like suddenly one of those guys at the table throws a bulletproof vest on. It's like, all right, and if he's not going to just turn on and pull the trigger, you can get out of it. So anyway, that's how I see the concept. And so, just as an aside, is this really the typical sentiment of what you'd expect a hawkish perspective, first strike kind of? No, I think Teller was really sort of a dove in hawk's feathers. Like he had his beliefs and he stuck to his guns, but he really thought mutual assured destruction was nuts and that we should get out of it as fast as we can. So that sets the stage. So this is actually a picture of Teller and Reagan. Teller much older than the pictures I showed you by the 80s. He had a significant influence on Reagan. So those statements inform why Reagan, and we don't get it, this is such a meaty topic. You could go on for weeks talking about each, Reagan could have had a truce with Gorbachev, but Reagan stuck to Strategic Defense Initiative and created the talks. It was so important to Reagan, even in mutually agreeing to reduce, the Soviet and the U.S. nuclear stockpiles. He thought this was a really good idea, just on its own merits, and it was enough to break, the possibility of making some progress on reducing the number of nukes. So anyway, that's just context. But when they kick off SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, it's not just space lasers. I guess that's the first thing. When we get in, what is SDI? It's not one system, it's more of this philosophy. Can we find a way to make nuclear weapons, and what we're really talking about is intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. Is there a way where we can render them ineffective? Where if they try to launch them against us, they don't have to hit, or if they do, they don't do any damage, or they miss their targets, or whatever. So that is SDI. It's really this little part. Give us the means of rendering nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. Let's go to the next level. Scientists of the national laboratories in the US, let's go to the future and figure out what the next thing is. There were many systems proposed in SDI. You had nuclear and non-nuclear laser systems. You had particle beam weapons. Those are real. They don't just show up in sci-fi. You had ground-based and space-based non-nuclear or tactical nuclear, meaning teeny tiny nukes, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not. There are nukes that are so small, they could basically implode I don't know, you can actually go really tiny at the ground floor of this building, and then it sort of becomes just like a dirty bomb. But if you did it, Teller started poking at, well, what if you did that right next to it? Because what's the problem? You've got a missile who's just been screaming through space, and you're trying to hit that with another missile, and everything's moving at, 6, 8, 12,000 miles an hour. And it's really hard to hit a speeding bullet with another speeding bullet. To this day, we have a problem with our interceptor systems because everything is moving so fast. Tyler said, well, if you make a big enough little bomb at the end, all you got to do is get close. So hence the tactical nuke interceptor thing. And he said, look, what's the risk trade there? You get a little radioactive iodine and some strontium going into the ocean, or you lose 2 million people in a city. That's not a bad trade. So anyway, we don't get into the politics here, but just trying to give you the top level view of what are we really talking about when someone says, oh, that old Star Wars program in the 80s. It's all of these ideas, and maybe most importantly, the computer and software systems that were going to guide these things. They didn't exist. These are so complicated. Like I mentioned, hit a bullet with another bullet, and you only start aiming your second gun after you hear the first one fire. That's not a whole lot of time to get the gun up and try and shoot the end and lead the, So if you imagine that now on rocket scales, it sounds impossible. So we actually learned a lot. The modern era has benefited greatly from the computer and software, if you want to think of computational and command and control, that was developed here under SDI. However, why don't we have SDI? Well, you can poke on quite a few reasons, but I think if you were to pluck the largest one out of the tree, I like to call it death by satire. So, after Reagan's speech, Reagan didn't, the people who were in the SDI program didn't come up with Star Wars. So people refer to it nowadays as Star Wars because shortly after Reagan's speech, Ted Kennedy was vehemently opposed to it. He said, too expensive, not realistic, no way we can do it. It's a jobs program, it's not going to go anywhere, it's going to be a big money draw. It's Star Wars. It's fantasy. It's sci-fi. So he was trying to make fun of it. And the name absolutely stuck. I mean, people really, in SDI, really tried to get out from under it. But then they were hampered by the fact that some of the people in SDI kind of liked it. So they're fighting, the SDI PR folks are fighting the media, and they're fighting their opponents, and they're fighting people in their own, organization. They're like, yeah, we're working on Star Wars, all right, let's do it. So basically, it was hopeless, and the term Star Wars stuck to this day, which is the fundamental nugget of this talk. So afterwards, there was merciless, constant satire that came afterwards. SDI or Reagan were both easy targets for this. I mean, because Reagan, having a more civilian background, being in Hollywood, Star Wars is the name of a fantasy Hollywood franchise. I mean, this all set the stage for these kind of political cartoons, which, what you can, Reagan's there in a Star Trek spacesuit, sitting in a Star Wars X-Wing, and literally the wheels have been ripped out, and it's sitting on blocks, like a car with the engine out, and the blocks are defense cuts. There's some acts that are going on at the time. Basically, it'll never get funded. It'll never be realistic, but Reagan saying, Scotty, more power to the phasers and stuff. Or you go to this one, where you've got Reagan, and he's saying, we've assembled a crack team of experts to advise us. And literally 3PO, R2, and ET. And these are really effective, Or you've got, the straightforward address. America has the technology, we'll build the interceptors, we'll use lasers and microwaves and all that. Thank you, good night, and then beat me up, Scotty. Nobody is taking this seriously. I mean, he reveals he's wearing a space uniform. Another variation on a theme, that's an R&D development chart up on the hill. As you can see, our newest weapons designer is an expert in fighting evil empires, and it's Yoda. So you can see where this is going, and this is a more recent cartoon looking at missile defense. Here are the cons. It's expensive, it cheeses off our allies, that's actually what it says, unites Russia and China against us. I mean, these are all fair points, that should be thought about. Probably doesn't work, something out of technical difficulties. And then the military guys are saying, hey, there's no downside, what are the pros? Pow, boom, zap, cool, because it's awesome. And so basically, all of this is mercilessly painting this as having no actual function or form. And it's just like a self-gratifying, guys get to get paid in the another one of this military-industrial complex just swallowing all of our tax dollars for nothing. Then you get the satire that's actually disturbing. It's effective because it's horrible. So this is how people were starting to promote Reagan. And I think this is, I'm embarrassed that I've looked at so many of these things now. I think this might have been in Newsweek, and it's in 85, so they're talking about the 86 defense budget request. So what they're saying is now Reagan in pushing SDI, what's that going to do? It's going to start a new arms race. Who has the better SDI? Who has more missiles in space to shoot down the other guy's missiles? So the media was really coming after the whole organization as this is not just bad, it's worse. So a completely diametrically opposed view to where Teller was coming from in saying, look, we should actually be pumping research into defensive technology, not offensive technology. And of course, like the space program, a little of column A can be used for column B, but they're not totally the same. And so, but you look at images like that and you don't forget it. And it really made a dent in the way people felt about Star Wars. So it's all loopy and it's dangerous. So, perhaps, I hope obviously at this point, the moniker was really harmful to SDI research and development programs, which were legitimate. I mean, the national labs, there were lots of them, as you'll see. The acting deputy director in 87 said, he went on record in a press conference saying the nickname, he was one of those fighting, against Star Wars. It gave the wrong impression, but here we get to see what the people working on SDI were worried about. It aided Soviet disinformation campaigns. Now, the reality behind the scenes now, we have a better view of what was going on in Russia at the time, or the Soviet Union at the time. They were terrified of this. Why? Because it meant, if we succeeded in any of this, it means that we were completely eliminating their leverage. So, in a titanic contest of wills, this was dangerous. And so they were dumping money into fueling things like the political cartoons and destabilizing public support for things like that. And terms like Star Wars, which our guys on the inside knew only made it easier for Soviet, disinformation to work. It already had momentum. All the Soviet agents had to do was just give a little nudge, it'll roll even faster and roll even faster. Carl Sagan actually gets, I love how, science is science and physics is physics. And if you go far enough, one branch of physics touches everything else. So here again, intersection of space and nuclear. Carl Sagan actually got involved. He traveled a lot. And so he had a network of other scientists and researchers over in the USSR, and he was able to collect, and from what other people were saying too, but he's also very good at boiling things down and looking at things from a top level. And what he said, in Russia, SDI was an economic attack, primarily. That's how they saw it. And that's actually how it worked a little bit. And he said it's equivalent to starting an economic war through a defensive arms race as another way to try and cripple the Soviet economy by getting them to try and keep up with us. Which, well, I think the history of these programs shows that was not the reason they were made. SDI was grown out of a real desire to create new technologies. However, this is a factor. This is one of the things that contributed to the Soviet Union coming apart. So, in a way, it had an effect, just not the one the researchers had in mind. So, death by satire was still what we're talking about. By '93, SDI was officially dead. Lack of social, political funding support. There were a few programs, though, and this is where, again, it gets confusing for people. That doesn't mean all programs died. They didn't. A few of them went on. So there was a renamed organization. It actually existed in the 70s and then went away. And then when SDI went away, they created it again, called the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization. And so that's what kept more of the grounded version of SDI technology going. So research dollars are still being spent, experiments are still being performed. Now, that was renamed again in '02 under President Bush, the second one, the Missile Defense Agency. But it has, as the name implies, a much more limited scope than SDI, and it's focusing mostly, for some exceptions, on land-based interceptors. That's what the sort of thing you hear about, Patriot missiles. Things going, they've got a whole bunch that are suddenly people are interested in after North Korea is creating rockets that can hit our west coast. So, hey, how do we shoot those down? But even today, you'll see terms when this comes up, and they're just editorial. This social perception of SDI as silly and dangerous is so deeply entrained that words like outlandish and technically absurd are just woven in like fact, in with reporting of the history of the Strategic Defense Program without any justification behind it. So I want to ask the question, were they really so absurd? Was it all as silly as the social perception is? So I think this all comes down, you can boil this sort of cleanly and avoid some of the mess of the way other people have asked these questions by saying, is Star Wars relevant? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I actually mean both. Is Star Wars SDI relevant, and is the comparison to Star Wars, the sci-fi franchise, is it relevant? Well, if you're thinking about SDI, well, of course. What North Korea is doing has reinvigorated the thinking on it, and it actually, so much so in the last year, since I made this talk the last time, I've had to go back and change this thing 25 times in the last 35 days, because things keep coming out, oh, I can use that, oh geez, they said that, wow. So take for instance, this is within the last, this is since January 17, U.S. created an A-11 Deputy Chief of Staff for Space Operations, new Space Operations Directorate. Now I know people are really, really, really up on the news. 2 days ago, the Defense Appropriations just axed this. So these next two slides are actually 2 days old, missed it by that much. But the point, it's irrelevant actually. It made it so far as to become an actual proposition on the Hill, so it still shows that the thinking is here. So what do we have? Why did they do this? Well, our military started realizing that every branch has its own space guys. And when I say space guys, well, it's not what you tend to think of. It's like, do we have GPS signals? Do we have communication signals? Do we have internet? And they are absolutely reliant on those three things. Talking, knowing where you are, and getting information. So that's duplicated in the Navy and the Air Force and the Marines and the Army. And people started talking and saying, you know what? This is probably only going to get more important with time. Not less, we're putting more stuff into space. More people are using GPS. There's a higher bandwidth. We're getting more reliant on it. Soon people's pacemakers will probably be powered by space, waves or something. So, I'm joking, but I hope. So, anyway, that's the thinking that led to this. What it also led to, and this is also what died 2 days ago, but maybe not forever, the US Space Corps. This almost happened and nobody knows about it. In the exact same way that the US Marine Corps is technically within the Navy, there was that general that I just mentioned, that position was specifically formed to manage this, which would be under the Air Force, in the same way the Marines are under the Navy. And it would be a way to consolidate everybody's space stuff under one hat, which you could see both. Their argument was, that's great, it'll streamline things and be efficient, and we'll be able to evolve it in a way that makes sense, as opposed to 4 different branches doing their own 4 different things. And then you got the other side, they go, we do not need another branch of the armed forces, more bureaucracy, blah, blah, blah. So these two were fighting it out. During the last 48 hours of negotiations, the we don't need another branch crowd won. But I think it was actually as a deal to get other stuff passed. So the Air Force got their money, and they were directed to keep looking into this. So they didn't say, don't do it. They said, we will not create that branch right now. But I just want you guys to be aware, when you're thinking about militarizing space, and this is what happened, the Outer Space Treaty of '67, we were really worried about SDI leading to nukes in space that were weapons, that, the Soviets could just start dropping bombs from a satellite on us. Well, thinking is starting to come around. This is from one of the big think tanks in the UK from last year. It's in a cybersecurity report. Now, as we all know, since all of our social security numbers and everything are all over the black market after the Experian failure and this and that, we're all paying more attention to cyber attacks, cyber vulnerabilities, China coming after us, Russia coming after us. Well, there's a section in this report that says, satellites and space assets, they're vulnerable too. They got to get their data in and out somehow. And vulnerabilities in space, if there's from cyber attacks, they pose serious risks to our ground-based infrastructure. How many, think of it simply or in a complex way. Shipping, I bet you every UPS truck uses GPS satellites to get where they're going now. I just think anyone actually has like the telephone book map open. No, they don't do that anymore. So ground-based critical infrastructure, and that goes all the way to power systems, repairing things, sewer lines, and insecurities in the space environment, I bolded it, will hinder economic development and increase the risk to society. So this is an awfully big leap. It doesn't seem so big until you think about it. They're basically saying, we need to dump a lot of resources into enhancing our cybersecurity so our space stuff doesn't get hacked, so that society doesn't crater. So what does that mean? We need to defend our space stuff. And this isn't a matter of, we need to, thwart the Russians who just put up a new space nuke. No, this is, we just need to defend our stuff, period. Because it's vulnerable to anybody, somebody in a basement. You take the point. So this is absolutely new territory, and I wanted to point this out. We're talking about military in space, but for defense. The same way we defend trade routes on the open sea. The Navy, Coast Guard, they're out there in part to help make sure nobody else torpedoes civilian stuff. Piracy, keep pirates at bay. It sounds like we may end up with the military moving into space from that perspective, from an economic perspective. And this is completely new territory. And there were a couple articles that came out just this last month in the Weekly Standard with headlines I couldn't believe, knowing I was going to give this talk. What do we need? Missile defense. When do we need it? Now. So a whole thing talking about, hey, maybe this isn't such a bad idea. Another one in the Weekly Standard, Bob Zubrin, better known as the founder of the Mars Society back in the day, there's another intersection of space and nukes. He worked on the NERVA program. Modern warfare will involve outer space. Wow, okay. Now, former Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy, just this last May, says once America has significant assets in space, those assets will need to be defended. This is real military guys now, talking about real stuff in space that has nothing to do with SDI. I mean, not directly. Then you got Major General Roger Teague. He's the director of the Air Force's space programs. Now, paraphrased in Popular Mechanics, again from May, says, look, America's adversaries are perfectly aware of the potential military advantage of space infrastructure, even kinetic operations, meaning the deployment of weapons from space. So all of a sudden, we're coming back to a lot of this same stuff, but from an absolutely clean perspective, if you want to think of it that way. There's no blah or kablooey or, satire cartoons aren't showing up when this shows up in Popular Mechanics. People are all going, oh, yeah, I don't want a hacker to take out my internet, stuff I buy with it. How am I going to get my refill of diapers or something? So that's all is SDI, the idea of strategic defense out in space. Is that relevant? Well, it certainly seems like, especially today, from a few different directions, North Korea directly, and now economically, as we're starting to realize just how reliant we are in space. Well now, let's switch gears totally. Let's say, okay, Ted Kennedy called SDI Star Wars to try and make fun of it. Is it actually more appropriate than he thought? Was it, or is it now? So consider, just consider the idea that what science fiction has to say could be relevant in real life. That's kind of a stretch. I mean, it's sci-fi because it's not real, right? However, let me point out a couple things. Jules Verne, who wrote sci-fi, conceptualized suborbital human flight 100 years before it actually happened. You read it there first. Arthur C. Clarke, one of his stories, invented the idea of the communication satellite network. The idea was so good, not only did it happen in exactly the way he predicted the orbit, the specific orbit where it would work. And that's why all communication satellites orbit in the Clark Belt today. So this distance between sci-fi and sci-reality is not actually, it can be, there is just fantasy out there, but let this roll around for a second. Could the Star Wars franchise itself be considered a rough proving ground? It's called Star Wars after all, space warfare, which is kind of where Ted Kennedy got the idea that you could use it to make fun of this thing. But consider this then. I submit that civilization is the most Star Wars-like now than it has ever been in human history. And so does that mean the Star Wars comparison just gets better as society gets more technologically advanced? Well, let me show you what I mean. Picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Up above, picture of a space cockpit from episode 1 in '99. Down below, picture of a space cockpit from Endeavour shuttle, 2004. Top frame, picture from Force Awakens from 2015. Bottom frame, pilot standing on his spaceship in 2005. Brian Binney winning the X Prize on Spaceship One. When the original Star Wars came out in '77, you could find no real photograph of a hotshot civilian pilot standing on the wing of his spaceship, but you can now. Let's keep going. Bipedal robots. In '77, it was a fantasy. Boston Dynamics has been doing it, and doing it quickly, and you'll see the YouTube videos, they're scary. These things are so nimble. You've got text that will kick the thing, and the way it processes, it will literally do this move in just the way that we do to stop itself. It's some of the most realistic, and then as soon as you're finished being impressed, you get kind of weirded out. You're like, well, that was really organic looking, and it came from this machine. Okay, how about this? You got so ignore the cute little droid here, but you've got a spaceport with junk turbines sitting in the background. That's the top frame from the Force Awakens. At the bottom is Mojave Spaceport, where you got junk turbines sitting out in the middle of the desert at a spaceport where things have gone to space. let's go a little further. From the original Star Wars in '77, that's the view of a small one-man fighter out of its forward cockpit. 2005, here's the view out of a forward cockpit from a small one-man fighter that went to space and back. So it gets even better when the new movies come out. From Rogue One, these are the Death Troopers, I think they call them, and then the Russians, just a month and a half ago, came out with a next-gen soldier program, where they have 3D printed armor, and it's following a lot of the same forms, so I'm going to leave that sitting there. Or what about bipedal robots with guns? Here's from episode 1 in '99. Bottom frame is from about 3 months ago. That is also from Russia. It is also a bipedal robot, and what you may not be able to see from the back is it's holding 2 absolutely normal handguns and proceeds on the videos to fire them and hit what it's aiming for. So, take, what was this? Attack of the Clones, so that'd be episode 2. Totally automated battle robots on the battlefield. Well, look, in 2016, we started creating the same stuff. Have we, the United States, started deploying them in battle yet? No, I think. Do they exist? Yes. Yes, they do. Completely automated spaceships. No humans at all. Well, I submit to you, at Phantom Menace in '99, you had these things that walked around and flew, and they obeyed commands, and ultimately, human pilots were better. Very few people know about the X-37B, which was a NASA light cargo and return vehicle shaped like the space shuttle, but you can see guys in self-contained breathing stuff there. This is a robot. It has flown to space 3 times, each time stayed up even longer. It's taken up by the Air Force. It has a payload bay. We have no idea what it does. It's entirely robotic. So, who knows? We do have space robots. And people know, almost nobody knows we have a second space shuttle. It's just the Air Force's. And then, because I absolutely could not resist this is a twist of art imitating reality, but in the latest the Rogue One Star Wars that just came out last year, it's literally, it plays out, you can think of it as the Star Wars universe's version of watching Oppenheimer through the Manhattan Project of the Death Star. They go through these scale tests, and they even test the Death Star's main laser out in a desert test area with the concentric circles that look exact. I think this is the, it's Easy Shot, it's Baker Easy. Yes. Anyway, out in Frenchman Flat. But you can see the obvious, these guys, I think the artists who did this literally looked at old test footage and then made the parallel. And there's another one, of course, much greater order of magnitude here, but the same kind of concentric disturbance. So, is it relevant? Well, now we're getting to the point where we're coming up with the space stuff before some of the movies. So, I think I made my point. At least the comparison can be made. You may dispute whether or not it's a really good one, but I think you could say, maybe parked inside the sci-fi world of Star Wars, where you've got people just thinking through, well, if this happens, then what would happen? Maybe we can learn something about strategic defense in space from the Star Wars films. So what do they suggest to us that strategic defense looks like in a spacefaring age? And if these movies are a proving ground, are there take-homes? Well, yes, there are. So, in George Lucas's episode 1, this whole movie kicks off with its own opening crawl that reads a lot like the Cuban Missile Crisis, actually, in space. There is a blockade of giant spaceships, and this is an economic blockade. No shots fired. They are simply preventing stuff from getting to or from that planet. So it suggests that space is an important theater of activity, and this is a political act. They're doing this to try and force someone's hand somewhere else on the ground. They're not directly confronting. Huh, okay, that's interesting. Sounds kind of like what that Air Force general said, doesn't it? What else? That movie plays, the same movie, and one of the advisors says, oh, communications disruption can only mean one thing, invasion. Well, I mean, I don't know about only one thing, but communications disruptions, all of a sudden, this is another, the importance of space-based assets, like communication satellites. Okay, that's a very important first step. What else? Well, we go forward to episode 5, and the Empire is hunting down our plucky heroes on the ice world. There is a giant ground-to-space gun. It's actually an ion beam, right, that disables all the electronics of one of these Star Destroyers. Well, what does that suggest? We call it ASAT, anti-satellite. Weapons are shown to be a critical means of planetary defense. It makes sense. If something's trying to get to you from space, maybe you could just shoot it from the ground. And then one of my favorite moments when I was kind of marching through this exercise to see what I could pull out of Star Wars, I realized the entire plot of The Empire Strikes Back, the whole thing, and then the entire plot of all the rest of the entire Skywalker saga hinges on one thing: a missile defense shield. So what happens? Our good guys are found out, the fleet shows up, and this guy who's, half an inch away from being choked by Vader all the time, he says, I'm so sorry, their shield's already up, and it's strong enough to deflect any bombardment. Full stop. That moment is the moment everything else could have ended. So that suggests they have orbital bombardment, which is sort of ominous, so you'd think really big bombs. Well, if they didn't have their shield up, some kind of defense shield, Vader bombs the base from space. Luke and Han and Leia all get evaporated, and all movies thereafter are done, and the Empire wins. So everything else flows from, it's only then, and he goes, okay, well, since the shield is still up, then you got to get in the walkers and go in the ground, then you got to blow up the shield generator, and then Vader can go down and try and catch him himself. And literally the missile defense shield is what let the rest of the whole saga play forward. So I thought that was a fun moment. And then, again, Rogue One, now these movies and the people who are making them, they're not making them in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s or even the early 2000s anymore. This is modern. So the screenwriters and the scriptwriters are acclimated to more of a Star Wars-like world. The thinking gets more sophisticated. So what happens here, if you guys, there's mild spoiler alerts if you haven't seen any of these. The conclusion of that film is intersectional. Meaning it's multiple theaters, what the military calls theaters of operation. You've got things going on in space, directly influenced by things that are going on sort of in air and sea, directly influencing and influenced by things going on the ground. So space isn't this theater of operations that's always up there. Literally, you keep bouncing around. It is critical that these guys in space take out this shield so that those guys on the ground can transmit something back out to space so that this air support protects these guys on the ground who ultimately have a space mission. So this idea that space is intersectional as a theater, that's new. And that's really kind of important when you think about it. Strange echoes, especially when we get to this next slide. And last, this Rogue One suggests that space assets are vulnerable to cyber attack and espionage. What is the whole plot of Rogue One? You are literally looking at hackers, literally hacking into, this is a cyber attack in progress, by which they take the Death Star plans, and in the next movie, episode 4 in the original, you blow up the Death Star. That is an enormous space asset that basically was brought down by a cyber attack. Again, strangely reminiscent of that UK Chatham House report from 2016. So if I were going to take a bead on, can you actually take something worth thinking about out of these films? I'd say, yeah, actually. And this is just top level. Maybe you could go deeper. Maybe there's something else in there that's useful. So getting to SDI itself. So what were the faces of Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative? Well, past to present, like I mentioned, this could be a whole other multi-hour thing. There were lots and lots, and the more you look, the more you find. but these are some of the top ones. So remember, this is more of a philosophy, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which trickled out to lots of different programs. Some systems never left the chalkboard, the whiteboard. Some systems reached a really high level of maturity. One of them I'm going to land on because I was fascinated to know that we actually flew one of these systems and nobody really knows it. So, my following slides show you the designs. So what do we have? One of the most famous is called Excalibur. It was canceled in '92. Basically, you blow up a nuke to create a power source to power an X-ray laser that could destroy multiple ICBMs before it was used up. I mean, that's pretty intense. It's a nuke-powered ray gun. Well, this was preempted by the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty. We couldn't launch things up anymore, and certainly, I mean, putting floating, functioning nukes in space is always problematic. So this died, I think, on the vine because there'd be no way to start launching these without probably starting a war, even though it's not intended to. And the interesting thing here is it would not function very well. You couldn't like fire this downward onto Earth because microwaves, like your microwave oven, works basically by vibrating water. So it's stuff with water in it that really heats up and moves. And so if you start firing this X-ray laser down through the atmosphere, which is filled with a lot of water vapor, basically it just cools off and the energy bleeds away and it spreads out. It's terribly ineffective. So, you know, you're not, anyway, we'll talk about that. Next one, you got a space-based laser which was chemical. Now, no nukes required. Okay, step in the right direction. You know, they're trying to find ways to reclaim this idea. I mean, there are targeting issues and things like that. However, again, all radiation spreads out. I mean, you can take this one in your pocket. If you double the distance, you quarter your dose. You quarter the intensity of the radiation. It works for a flashlight beam. It works for a radiation beam, which is a kind of radiation. By this I mean, if you take one distance and you measure how intense that death ray is, if you go one more of those distances, the intensity is going to be 25%. If you do it again, it's going to be 25% of that. It's just physics. So that's a problem with all of these laser systems, is you need them to be very focused. And I mean, it's hard. These are real, especially in the 80s. These are genuine hard challenges to tackle. Now, airborne chemical lasers. Oh, and the problem also on this last one is you have to refuel. You got to bring more chemicals up. So now you got a resupply issue. How do you do that? Do you try and do it with robots? Or do you send astronauts up with your space shuttle? Which is one of the reasons, you know, people were interested in the space shuttle. There were a couple Air Force missions. But anyway, just logistics are hard. There was a chemical laser, but for the same reason I told you microwaves don't work well in the atmosphere, there's all sorts of, and this is why stars twinkle at night. If you go out into space and look at the stars, none of them are twinkling. Is the sun twinkling? No. Are any stars out there really twinkling? No. You can find some. Not really, no. So why do all the stars twinkle? Same reason that city lights twinkle. There's air in the way. And normally, when you're looking between you and me, there's not enough air moving around to interrupt the light. But if you get enough, like you're 10, 20 miles away from a town, or billions upon billions of miles away from stars, there's faint light and it's getting hit by all this atmosphere. So the problem is, you try and fire a laser through the atmosphere, you're going to have to deal with these effects. They're called adaptive optics. And I'll actually tell you, the work done to try and fix it didn't benefit the military so much as it benefited astronomers who were trying to look at light through the atmosphere. So military adaptive optics technology was actually trickled down, and it's helping every astronomy postdoc and PhD and grad student in the world, you know. And marching forward. And then we got Project Argus. So this much earlier program was canceled in '59 because it was blowing up nukes in space on purpose. Check out this idea. So these all have seemed similar, you know, lasers to take out ICBMs as they're coming in. And this was, what if we detonate nukes in the upper atmosphere on purpose to create our own artificial radiation belts so intense they take out the enemy missiles? So this had a name. I mean, so would it even work? It was called, it's called the Christophilus effect. A guy actually predicted this in the 50s, and it worked. So, I mean, these are actually, we don't have any pictures of the Argus missiles going off, so I stole some from Starfish Prime, which is similar, but these are actual, this is a nuke blowing up in the extreme upper atmosphere, technically out of the atmosphere, open space, and then the radiation left over makes these beautiful northern lights, except they're not northern lights, we made them, which, by the way, if you didn't know, the northern lights are caused by space radiation hitting the atmosphere, so it gives a kind of cosmic, anyway, we're glad the atmosphere and the magnetic field are here. So, and if you want to know more about that, come to the talk in early December from Dr. Cucinato, who will explain to you all about space radiation. Seriously, you guys should come to that. He's a global expert. So, what did they find? If you do this, it does affect radio and radar transmissions. It can damage or destroy enemy electronics. That'll work. But it would also really danger crews in spacecraft in Earth orbit. So, I mean, for all these reasons and more, we probably don't want to be just sprinkling nuclear fission products all around the world just to take out ICBMs. That was canceled early. There is an airborne solid-state laser that is using semiconductor technology. That is actually still going. I think that's Boeing, I think they call it First Light. But there's still a problem with logistics. You got to take about power. To power a laser that strong, you have to have a plane in the air in the right radius at the right time. So our computers are getting better, and targeting is getting better. But you still have this problem of, do you know where a nuke is going to actually be launched? Are you going to have bombers in the air, planes in the air all the time? What about your rogue operators? Or what about decoys? I mean, these are all good questions. It doesn't mean they don't have answers, but they're good questions. But then we get to my favorite. Brilliant pebbles, which literally means smart rocks. So what does this thing do? This thing sits up in orbit, and it literally has a package of rocket-propelled rocks. Now, they're not quite rocks, they're tungsten slugs, but they're literally just blocks of metal. They don't do anything, except when their rocket turns on, they move very fast and smash into something in space. And in space especially, there's no resistance in the air. You know, equal and opposite reaction is particularly energetic. It will just obliterate anything that it hits. But they're small enough. I mean, if you fired them down and somehow targeted your Volvo, it would probably crater your Volvo, but it's not really, you couldn't really say this is an offensive weapon from space. So this seems to be one of the most benign things that you can put up into space that would actually have a shot, because since these little projectiles are small, they can get up to speed real quick. So if you had a guidance system, and we've got a warning system called Midas from way back, which could detect the heat plumes from enemy missiles as they come off. And so this one, to me, automatically passed what I call my giggle test. Yes, sir?
How small are the projectiles?
Well, if you look at the overall size of, I can find you the exact specific word, but there's no scale on this. Here, let me show you the next. They're basically 2 feet, 2 feet-ish, with some hardware on the back. So, I mean, they're big, but they're not like this. Yeah. So, great, this is cool. So I automatically sort of honed in on this, particularly because I just like the name. I mean, Brilliant Pebbles. Well, nobody knew. So you may remember when SDI was canceled in the early 90s, it got kind of swept, what was left of it got swept under this new old thing, the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization. And it all happened quietly. No one really knew about it until NASA partnered up with them to launch what they call the Clementine spacecraft. It was a science mission, doing some more moon exploration, geology. That's what they ended up finding, water in some of the shaded craters on the moon, and cool stuff. This is Brilliant Pebbles. So about half the spacecraft and Livermore's Brilliant Pebbles sensor package was the brain and guts of the Clementine mission. Well, that's pretty cool. So we actually flight proved everything for Brilliant Pebbles except those little impactor propulsion systems. And those are pretty simple as rocketry goes. The whole propulsion system for Brilliant Pebbles was actually tested on another rocket system in '94. So by the early '90s, kind of in bits and pieces, we'd actually flown just about every bit of hardware for brilliant pebbles. So there's a thing called TRL levels, and you may or may not hear it somewhere. It just basically means how reliable is this thing for going to space. TRL 1 means I just thought of it. TRL 9 means it's already been there and back. So everything in NASA, you want to take all your hardware from the spigots on the valves on the things all the way to the computers and the hard drive. You got to fly all that stuff so it hits TRL 9. Well, Brilliant Pebbles is really close to TRL 9 altogether. So that is, to me, that was one of the coolest, well, most surprising things is we have a Star Wars system that could be ready to fly. And it doesn't involve any nukes. No nuclear power, anything. So what people were scared of doesn't exist with this one. So, wrapping this thing up a little, why not missile defense? So, like I mentioned, more often than not today, when you read, and it's starting to change, but even with those key articles I cherry-picked out and showed you guys, the predominant view is still negative for SDI. Terms like outlandish, technically absurd, and they just are claimed and then moved on as though this has been proven so many times it's not even worth explaining. People just believe it. Well, the success of that Clementine mission, some of the other efforts that made it quite a ways, it starts to seem like this fundamental opposition to SDI is cultural, more like these images worked, not that they're technical necessarily. And you could argue the political point of, well, what happens if we destabilize mutual assured destruction? Well, we're not really sure. We're still staring down 7,000 Russian warheads, sort of. And sometimes it gets a little trickier at times than others. But it's not like it was, not with them. So, and with North Korea, the asymmetry is definitely stacked toward us. And they would definitely, I think, definitely be the first ones to launch a nuclear strike. So the water may be primed. The Air Force is thinking about it. Civilians are thinking about it. Maybe it's a good idea. And the world's becoming more spacefaring. We're putting more assets in space. Commercial space stations are being designed, will probably be flown. Commercial spacecraft are being designed. If you believe them, they may be flying within the next year. They'll have been saying that for almost a decade. But we're all definitely becoming more space reliant with time. Our internet goes through space. It's a fact. So you can create all of our communication systems, all of our location systems. And when I teach geology every now and again at the community college, I'm shocked at how many, with every passing year, how few people have any idea how we navigated from point A to point B if we'd never been there before. I mean, certainly, you put the GPS in now, you get familiar with the route, and then you can probably make your way back there. But I just throw the question out there. How do you think when I got my learner's permit, my fresh driver's license, how did I get to a friend's house? And I'd never been there before. And you should see, like, the dawning realization, like, oh my God, how did you do that? I don't know how, what? And then I said, okay, you know about telephone books at the 7-Elevens where the public phones were? And they go, public phones. So I have to walk through and you play Battleship. Yes. Okay. Well, you divide the city into a grid, you look up the street name in a table, you find the grid number, and you plot your own route. You have to read each street. Oh, like, how did you live like that? The point is, there are more of them than there are of those of us who do know the telephone books, and that will only get worse, it seems, unless we start like orienteering indoctrination in elementary school or something. That's not going to happen anytime soon. So we are getting more vulnerable. We are getting more vulnerable in terms of our space assets. And well, would a defensive system with dual space applications like Clementine, could we really consider that weaponizing space? What if we put up a bunch of brilliant pebbles, Clementines, do you think, I don't know the answer to this question, but on its face, I know I don't feel like you could really call that weaponizing space. That is a defensive weapon. I mean, you could turn it on your enemy's satellites, but then again, that's the risk that a lot of this technology is dual use. So, anti-satellite in space. We even had recently declassified, it's not on the slide, but I'll mention it. The CIA and Air Force had a space station. It never flew. It was called MOL, Manned Orbiting Laboratory, and it used Gemini spacecraft. This was all happening in the 60s and 70s. And it all came out because one of the MOL spacesuits, it looks like a shuttle spacesuit, which were orange. This was blue. And it came out in like a Smithsonian exhibit. And people started going, what? I mean, the space geeks know every suit. Like, oh, that white one with the red stripe is from that mission, and this one, and they get in there and they're like, blue? Where did that come from? And then all of a sudden there was a FOIA request and this whole space program came out, and it was basically, the U-2 was a camera plane, right? Well, what if you actually put it all the way up in space, then it just keeps going over, and you can put a military astronaut up there to keep taking pictures, sending the film back down, and you can do that, logistically for far longer than you can with U-2. So it was very interesting. It's like, oh, Ben, why are you telling me all this stuff? You're a space geek, but come on, keep it under control. The reason it's relevant is there's only one section in that report that's redacted today. And it is really interesting to me because it means that with this old technology that's all out there, in the list of things that an astronaut could do for the CIA or defense, there's all the stuff that we know about, fix things, There's one of those ideas was so good, they're still keeping it to themselves, and it's more than half a century old. So, what is that thing? Well, as it turns out, Deke Slayton let it go by accident. So if you're any guys into the original Right Stuff folks, Deke, before he passed away, referenced, what we now know as MOL. The Air Force was playing with this thing with Gemini craft. And I'll preface this by saying there's one word that made it out, not that I've read all of it, but I have. There's one word that came out, and it was called saint. In this whole document, in all the redacted stuff that I could find. Saint. It was all caps. Well, if anyone's worked in the intelligence world, INT normally means intelligence. So something intelligence, like SIG-INT, signal intelligence. Well, saint, it didn't go anywhere until I finally found it. Satellite intercept. And that's what Deke said. He goes, oh yeah, the Air Force had this idea about sending guys up there to go grab the Russian satellites and stuff. So, interesting that that whole thing is still redacted. I can't say I know what's underneath it, because I don't. But speaking strictly as a civilian who does not know what's underneath it, it's probably about stuff like, let's go grab, sabotage, change, steal other people's satellites, which goes all the way back to what the Air Force generals are saying today about assets in space, control the space environment. We need to be able to defend our own space assets. China set up their own station with their own astronauts, which was a military space program. It's about the same size as MOL. They were doing a lot of rendezvous stuff. Not that I'm suggesting anything, but I'm saying all the pieces are out there for SDI ideas to not just be weaponizing space, but to be, we are now entering space. And in the same way that the Army built forts when we started moving west in the United States to protect civilians, the same thing looks like it is happening as what we rely on goes farther and farther out to space. I'm drifting on here. Anyway, so, take home. In today's Star Wars-like world, which is really a lot more like Star Wars than it ever was in '77, it seems to me worthy to question whether or not the philosophy of arming us with shields instead of swords is absurd, or was it ever absurd? So, something to think about on the way home. Any questions? Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
The Moran system that the U.S. Coast Guard used, I understand most of them were decommissioned, but then I read that they were bringing some of them back because when the satellites aren't working, Moran can still be used for navigation.
Yes, that I'm not familiar with that specific system, but I do know that because this is such a problem, a lot of the branches are looking for ways to cover themselves. So that doesn't surprise me at all. I know the Army has been working over at Dugway Proving Grounds and out in Texas with using aerostats, basically blimps, to be floating radio and data repeaters to cover the same function. So if you lose something, you can fly up your own low altitude, temporary, but cover yourself. So yeah, that absolutely sounds plausible, probably true. Yeah, thank you. Yes, sir.
Your thoughts or opinions on what happened a couple years ago with the Chinese? Didn't they destroy one of their decoy? Was that
Yes.
laser, or was that a smart?
No, that's a great point. You know, I always have to pick and choose what I get to throw in here. So one of the things I really, and I promise you, I did not plan him out there. One of the things I really wanted to talk about, but I decided ultimately it was better left for the Q&A, was the Chinese. You remember, I just threw it up on one slide, ASAT. And I used it when the rebels fired that thing from the surface of Hoth and took out a Star Destroyer in orbit. Anti-satellite maneuver. China had a very famous, now, ASAT maneuver, where they say that they, if I remember the scenario right, that they had a satellite that they'd lost communications with, and you know, to save the thing, they blew it up from the ground with the projectile, like Empire Strikes Back style. So what was that really? Well, every time we launched a rocket in the space race, we were saying to the USSR, we can take an astronaut off the top and put a warhead on top. Our rockets, so every time we went farther, every time we went faster, we were also saying to the world, we can also send a nuke farther and faster. So in the exact same way, and I think the majority of folks who kind of poke around in this stuff view what China did as a way of declaring to the world that, hey, we can shoot your satellites down too. So that's part of what has really, tickled the brains of a lot of our own defense folks, is knowing the capabilities like that are out there. I mean, I'm not sure we actually ever did a practical test, but the Russians did. So now China's in the ballgame, and you start looking at maneuvering superpowers on the global stage. But yeah, my sense of that scenario was they were definitely flexing their muscles for the world. They said, oh, I'm sorry, it's sprayed junk, we won't do it again. We only needed to do it once. So, is that what you had in mind? Yeah, that was a great question. Yes, sir.
Space is an incredible, unforgiving environment. And once there is some stuff over there, it will not go away. It will stay in the same orbit. And if things are hitting each other, I mean, they can release a lot of energy and a lot of more stuff. And that is then also very quickly around the Earth. And that is called also the Kessler effect.
Yes.
And because this effect is exponential. I mean, it is not only adding it up, it is exponential. I mean, it is an incredible risk of putting more stuff into space because, I mean, sometimes it can really hit each other and then explode and then create more garbage over there. And I mean, as far as I know, there are some model calculations saying that in 40 to 60 years, certain areas in space are so full of garbage that we cannot use it at all. And I mean, if we are now militarizing space, I mean, things will get only sooner to that point. And there is no way to taking things back.
Yeah, it's so you bring up a very good point. It's one that people are talking about a lot. And one thing I want to keep in mind is that space is also very big. one thing that movie Gravity with Sandra Bullock did wrong is they literally took everything, things that orbit. Our GPS satellites are 20,000 miles up. The space station is like 150. Excuse me. Well, that's a huge spread. Excuse me. And it was all compressed in one plane. So all Sandra Bullock had to do is go left or right and find everything else in space. Not terribly realistic. So when you are, excuse me for a second, some water.
Welcome to Nevada.
Allergy season. Or anytime the weather changes. That's right. Try it out. So, I mean, yes, you're right. The space junk is, will fraction into smaller and smaller pieces. That's an exponential process. You get a lot of junk out there. But I also think it's misrepresented. There is a lot of volume out there, and the odds of strikes are still exceedingly low. One point is the LDEF spacecraft. We actually put something out in space and let it get hit by space dust for, I think, 6 months. And then the shuttle came back and grabbed it and took it back. Or maybe it was more than a year. Anyway, they exposed it for a while and saw how much material stood up to it. And the good news is, most of the dust arriving from space and micrometeorites are going faster than our own space junk. So they are still, unless they're big chunks, tiny chunks of our junk will bounce off of our space shields. They call them Whipple shields. They'll be less damaging than the actual nuggets traveling much faster that come from somewhere else. But the other point I wanted to make is getting the military out there gets things done. So I don't necessarily advocate. I'm kind of ambivalent on it right now. I think any presence in space is good because it helps. The more things you have, more contingencies. You've got more supply lines, things like that. I think if the military gets out there and puts a lot of its own assets out there, and all of a sudden the space junk is a problem, they'll just dump a lot of money into cleanup, and then we will have a market for the orbit sweepers, which, it doesn't actually have to be more complicated than that. Yeah. So, on the flip side, sort of myopically, if you put more stuff out there, it can make it all worse. But I think once we are out there, and once it becomes a problem, we'll fix it, we'll solve it, even if it's expensive, because the alternative is worse if we suddenly can't talk to each other or drive around anymore. Yes, sir?
Well, on that same subject, and
There it
it
is.
was stated here that it gets up there and it just stays up there, but isn't there a way that if you look at time, a much bigger picture, it's going to fall out?
Yes, absolutely. So the atmosphere is very diffuse. There's not a hard line. There's a trickle, and it kind of fades out. But there's still, even at the space station, there's drag.
Thank you.
And that's why they have to keep pushing the space station up. They need reboosts, even at 100-something miles. So if you get really high up, that'll probably stay up there a lot longer. But things like light pressure, they'll still bring things down. But now anything in what we call low Earth orbit, it'll come back, whether it's a decade or something less, depends on its orbit. But there are mechanisms there that will bring it back. You're right. So only certain zones are really vulnerable to that effect. But no, that's a good point. There is drag out there depending on how close you are. Yes, sir. I should probably let you guys
With the
go.
history of ICBMs, most of those were made back in the 60s and 70s. They're old technology. We have GPS systems now that blow that technology away. I find it hard to believe that the military hasn't figured out, with all the hacking that's going on, with all these young guys that they're hiring, and they're having hacking shows here so they can steal these guys and take them to the government. I can't believe that they haven't figured out a way to hack into those missiles so that if and when they do launch them, they're going to know their systems and they're going to throw them all off and they're going to end up in the ocean. It just doesn't make sense that they wouldn't be able to do that.
It's a
because
great...
the stuff is such old technology.
Yeah, it's
The
a great...
missiles are old.
I'm
Korea
with you.
is doing what we did 30, 40, 50 years ago. They're thinking they're big shots, and that stuff is so outdated, it's ridiculous.
The irony is it's the fact that they're old that saves them.
Right.
So let me give you a parallel. There was a scare 6 months or a year ago about hackers getting into our nuke plants. And it was reported in a few outlets, hey, and that someone did hack into a nuke plant. What they actually hacked into was the equivalent of an administrative assistant's email account. They didn't like hack into the control computer for the nuclear reactor. And what came out after that is nuclear reactor computing systems, they go with what's been proven, and it's kept off network. So there's literally no connect. That was, if you guys heard of Stuxnet, it actually took joint, just like Road One, it took espionage to plant an actual thumb drive into an Iranian centrifuge connected computer, which was not on the internet because they were German centrifuge and blah, 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 blah. So I mean, it was one of the, that's like a shot, I think history's gonna look back at that as a shot heard around the world, the very first internet missile strike that took down an actual facility. But it required actually getting there and plugging in. So a lot of the silos, I'm sure North Korea is getting all their stuff from China or Russia. They're not connected to the internet. So the problem, it's like being a Luddite. If you don't have a computer to hack, there's nothing to hack into if it's all vacuum tubes. I'm exaggerating, but that's actually literally what forms a very nice firewall for a lot of our simpler but industrial sorts of systems. And while I can't claim to know that that's what North Korea is doing, that is what has worked for us in the past. And I will also tell you, vacuum tubes are radiation resistant, just as a side note. So you'll fry a circuit, a modern circuit, and a vacuum tube stereo you got sitting over there will keep playing through the whole nuke blast. So there's a great story, just a quick aside, which I think I'm trying to illuminate, this question. When we captured a MiG, I think we talked about it over that wall over there in that area that we don't like to mention out loud. We found that as the story goes, we started opening up the MiG. And a lot of this, just like how we outspent the Russians for SDI, there's a lot of posturing. And are we really where we say we are? There's a front. Are we just going to trick our opponent to outspend us and they go broke? Well, we didn't have to spend the money because it was never real. So we cracked open their MiG and we found vacuum tubes inside. And all the guys on the ground were like, yes, we're way ahead of those guys. And they brought in the schematic and the box of tubes, and they went back in and they brought it to the analyst. So the radiological engineer, the one who was actually going to assess the system, and he went pale. He went, oh no. And the guy's like, what are you worried about, man? These are old tubes, this is awesome. He goes, they'd keep flying if a nuke went off and all our planes would drop out of the sky. They are way ahead of us. So it's that idea that this perceptual asymmetry, they may be using old tech on purpose because they know we can't hack it. So it's something to think about.
Old Macintosh. Macintosh.
Yes.
I'll keep it.
Yeah, there you go. They all sound better. Yeah, yes.
In western South Dakota, there is a Minuteman Missile Museum, and you can visit in it when it's been deactivated. But I understand some of the Minuteman missiles in Montana are still active. Their operating system was an 8-inch floppy. They were not on the internet.
Thank you that's exactly my point. They have those sort of redundancies. So yes, we should wrap this up. I know we're keeping you guys. Thank you very much. If you have more questions, please come see me up here.